Thanks for joining me back here on the channel. In this episode, we're going to knock out part 1 of 2 for the Airfix 172nd Skyhawk build. In part 1, I'll walk you through the build sequence leading up to the point where we're ready to airbrush the completed airframe. We'll come back in part 2 to airbrush that airframe and complete the build. As always, I appreciate you tuning in to Flying S Models, and I hope that you'll consider subscribing to the channel. If you like what you see here, you can also check out my Facebook page at Facebook.com/Flying S Models and correspond with me over there, or just leave me some feedback here in the comments section. Let's get rolling on part 1 of the Skyhawk build. The 172nd Skyhawk starts off with the cockpit, as is typical for most model airplanes. While the kit ejection seat is pretty decent, I decided to replace it with a more detailed resin seat from True Details. As I highlighted in the kit review, the cockpit consoles and instrument panel are represented by decals. And I'm not a huge fan of this approach, as it typically appears two-dimensional and to me a bit toy-like. To fix that problem, I cut small sections of evergreen strip styrene to represent the individual switch banks on the console. I glued these to the cockpit consoles to provide a three-dimensional look. When that was complete, I gave everything a base coat of flat black, and then I followed this up with a thin coat of interior gray. I used Tamiya Sky Gray for this. By painting the black base coat first, it helps to add some depth to the overall gray paint that comes over after that. The gray is lightened a little bit with the flat white, and I airbrushed lighter shades onto the high spots to give more dimension to the overall effect. Per my usual process, I come back with a dark oil wash, using raw umber darkened with a little lamp black, and then thin with mineral spirits so that the wash will run into the recessed areas. This puts a little dirt in the ditches, as I like to call it, and helps bring out some of the details in both the seat and the cockpit console sidewalls. Once this is dry, I come back with a lightened and thin coat of gray just to blend everything in. I like to add some visual interest anywhere I can on a model, and for the Skyhawk, it's the nose wheel for me. The kit part is obviously molded in the straight configuration, but sometimes you see Skyhawks on a carrier deck with the nose wheel canted a little bit. So I cut the nose wheel off the kit part and drilled small holes to allow me to insert a cut off section of a needle in order to turn the nose wheel just a little bit to the starboard side. With the base coat colors down on both the cockpit and the seat, I come back with vallejo acrylics and I brush paint all of the various details. For the ejection seat, I start by painting some of the raised areas with a lighter shade of gray. After that, I come back in and paint white on the belts, the seat back straps, and the headrest. When the white's dry, I paint the headrest areas red and then paint the ejection handles and other small details with a little bit of yellow. To bring out smaller details like the straps and belts, I take a fine brush dipped in vallejo black and run it along the outside edges of these features. This really makes these features pop, especially since they're so small in this scale. For the side consoles, I mix a little vallejo black with khaki to get an off black shade for the switch banks. These are painted, and when dry, I come back in with a little gray and white and paint various dots to represent the switches and knobs. With the cockpit painting complete, except for that instrument panel, I install it in the fuselage. I also add the exhaust pipe that has been painted flat black. I did dry brush a little silver on the turbine face, but it really won't be seen. Before I close up the fuselage, I need to rework that instrument panel, as well as install some nose weights so the model won't be a tail sitter. For the instrument panel, I used my Waldron micro punch set to create a few gauges. I come back in and paint and weather it in the same way I did the other cockpit components. When this is dry, I paint each gauge flat black. Then I come back in with a very fine brush and some vallejo white and paint various details on the instrument gauges. After the white's dry, I mix a little 5-minute epoxy, and using a toothpick, I add a drop of epoxy to each gauge to represent the instrument bezel. I also use some of the leftover epoxy to secure the nose weight into the nose. I used a lead fishing sinker as well as one small copper jacketed BB for the nose weight. When I've got the nose weight in, I then installed the reworked instrument panel into the cockpit. The Airfix compressor intake is really nice. It's a multi-part assembly, and it's got a nicely detailed compressor face, a splitter plate, and the intake trunk. It fits really well within the fuselage halves. When the compressor assembly is installed, I could close up the fuselage and get ready to add the intakes, the wings, and horizontal stabilizers. These go on without any issue, although I did have to do a little scraping and sanding to get the intake pieces to fit right. The wing center section is also just a little bit wide where it attaches to the fuselage, so this had to be sanded just a tad. But other than that, things go together really well. There are a few gaps that need to be filled, and for this I decided to use to me a superfine putty since they were really small gaps. To make sure things stay neat, I tape off around the area that I'm going to fill before I apply the filler. And then after the filler is applied, I remove the tape, and you can see how neatly the filled gap looks. When all the gaps are filled and the tippy and putty is dry, I sanded everything down using a 400 grit sanding pad, and then I came back with a little fine sanding cloth to polish everything prior to painting. So we'll stop here and wrap up the first of a 2-part Skyhawk build. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're a new subscriber or you haven't clicked on the notifications bell, make sure to do that now so you can get automatic notifications when I post the second and final episode in this build series. Again, thanks for tuning into the channel. I appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.